First, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. It's a real pleasure and delight. And for my talk today, I know we're going to spend a great deal of time throughout the day talking about how to make technology more powerful. I want us to spend time during this talk reflecting on how technology makes people more powerful. And to do so, I actually want to take us back not 20 years, but to 1945, and to the vision of scientist Vannevar Bush and the reflections that he had at the close of World War II. As he was traveling across the Pacific, he was reflecting on the importance of computing technology during the war effort and essentially the machines of war at the time, but he was also reflecting on the state of science. And he predicted, looked forward, envisioned for our community an era where science would be able to change dramatically because of how information technology would be able to pull together the fabric of information available to us and create new ways that would support human cognition, collaboration, and discovery and innovation. And to do so, he envisioned a machine for us called the Mimics. And the Mimics would be a storehouse of the world's information, all of the documents, all the books, all of the journals associated with science. Because up until then, even though science had changed dramatically, the practice of science still was very much the same. And people would be able to come together and use this machine. It would augment their natural capabilities in terms of how they would be able to visualize information, how they would be able to see it on the screen, and it would become a surrogate memory for them. And then they would be able to follow associative trails, not traditional trails, but associative trails that mirrored how people thought through and worked through this information. Now, many people read the seminal article in The Atlantic, as we may think, but two key individuals who were influenced by this work were J.C.R. Licklider and then Douglas Engelbart. And, of course, both of these individuals should be well known to this community. Licklider, of course, had most of his influence through the work that he did in this great city in creating the foundation for many, many rounds of federal investment in information and computing technologies that led eventually to the internet and the backbone of the communication infrastructures that Farnham and told us about this morning. However, they also provided the foundation for the funding for Douglas Engelbart's work at Stanford. And his, hopefully everyone has heard of the expression, the mother of all demos. And the mother of all demos at that point in time showed for us the very beginnings. It was the very first demonstration of a computer mouse, also a QWERTY keyboard. It was the very first demonstration of hypermedia, hypertext, voice conferencing, and by the way, throw in a collaborative editor as well. Now, of course, as the mother of all demos, it was hung together by Scotch tape and all the way that demos work today, but he created that community that was so inspired by what these capabilities represented. Now, of course, the story of what happens after that is more well known. It ignited the valley. A bunch of people collected at this place called Xerox PARC. A bunch of folks got frustrated working for Engelbart. They went over to Xerox PARC, and they worked and produced the very first commercial product, not successful commercial product, but successful product, the Xerox Star. And what that did, as this old screenshot represents, is it again captured that first fundamental, that we could create visual tools that allowed individuals to offload what they held in their head and put that on the screen, and that became more and more powerful for them. Now, this part of the story has been told from many times, many perspectives. Suffice to say that Apple and Microsoft have proved the economic vitality of these ideas. But let's continue the thread and look again about what it means for the relationship of visual computing as we go forward. So now, not only do we have visual tools that allow us to put information that we interact with in front of us, but we can start to author visual information in new ways. So we have the era of desktop publishing, again, another spin-off commercial success. But now we see a convergence. We see the connection of those initial investments all the way back to Licklider and what eventually became the internet for us, coming together around visual computing, around visual interaction and publishing, and we get the World Wide Web. And so suddenly not only do we have information that is immediately accessible to us, but we now are being able to create a new form of interactivity with that information. Now, this matters in many fundamental ways. First off, you can go and click on interact the information, but look a little bit at this screenshot. It's about do something. It's about rallying people to come together around a certain cause. The ability to reach out and form communities across this internet of information, again, harkens all the way back to Bush's initial vision. Not necessarily just scientists anymore, but how people are able to come come together and act together because of this information. Now, we have some surprises along the way. It turns out that people do not only react to the visual presentation of information, but if you provide the equivalent of a blank page available to them, but with the appropriate instructions and the appropriate communities around it, you begin to form knowledge communities. Wikipedia, according to all theory beforehand, should not have been successful. It should not have existed. But nevertheless, we now have a knowledge community that exists across multiple languages, multiple cultures, tremendous amounts of information, and amazingly, beyond all predictions, quite accurate. Now, we not only have Wikipedia, but hopefully many of you have seen this site as well, North Korea Uncovered, a different form of a blank page. So in this case, instead of writing an encyclopedia, it's about a community coming together where each individual has one piece of information, two pieces of information, but when they act together, suddenly an entire map or an entire region is exposed. Again, like Wikipedia, the validity and fidelity of this information is much higher than ever anticipated and competes quite well with traditional intelligence methods. So let's continue this thread. We've created this web of information where people are coming together. I don't want to be there. But let's go back to some of the other parts of Bush's vision. He also understood that how people interacted with information was critical. So it needed to be visually available. You need to be able to communicate. You needed to be able to collaborate, but you needed to be able to interact with that information. Now, I suspect everyone in this room recognizes this device. The iPad. My mom was very excited to get one for Christmas. There was a wonderful panel, congressional briefing last fall called Deconstructing the iPad. And I'm shamelessly stealing information from that panel where they were able to take every component of this device and look at the long trail of federal investment and federal research that has gone into making this particular product successful. So focusing in on the human-computer interaction part of this. Oh, I do not want that audio. Can we kill Ben's audio? There we go. We love Ben, but we don't need to listen to him. All right. So let's talk about touchscreens, right? So we had the basics. Remember, we have an Engelbart in the mouse. We have the basics in the mouse. But NASA didn't want astronauts to try to use a mouse in space for some very good reasons. So initial fundamental research in the development of touchscreens, and this is a particular demo from 1991 where Ben Schneiderman is demoing one of the very first touchscreen interfaces. There's also a gentleman there who visited University of Maryland around 1988 to see the results of this research. Remember, good artist copy, great artist steal. I mean that with all love and appreciation. Now let's look at zoomable user interfaces. So DARPA, back with the Command Post of the Future, wanted ways for individuals to be able to interact with complex sets of information. Again, where did interaction and visual interfaces allow new forms of cognition, new forms of collaboration, and new forms of thinking and sifting through these vast stores of information? So you had the very beginning in the mid-90s of zoomable user interfaces. Again, now something that is commonplace in our interaction with these devices. And then finally, I love the history of this around multi-touch gestures. Tremendous long history in terms of investment by federal research, in terms of looking at how one could use multiple fingers in interacting with the touchscreen. You have the Plato project at Illinois. I actually pulled up last night the 85 paper coming out of CMU that again looked at the core structures of how you would build a multi-touch gesture system. And then you have the work with FingerWorks. So this is a student on an NSF graduate fellowship working with a professor on an NSF research grant, creating multi-touch interfaces. Eventually, through the support of Delaware, they created a spin-out company called FingerWorks. FingerWorks was actually oriented towards assistive technology, so this is actually a story related to that history as well. So looking at interfaces that would make computing technology more accessible to people with disabilities, and conveniently bought in 2005 by Apple, including all the intellectual property associated with that. So I hope I've made the argument, as well as other presenters before me, that the legacy is clear, that from 1945 all the way to today, that we have a virtuous cycle of visioning coming from pioneers, coming from scientists who are able to look at the potential of these technologies and see within that vision that we can change the fabric of human society and how we interact with information together, And what we've seen, and Farnham showed the diagram as well, is this beautiful iteration of initial investment by federal research, the work becoming and showing up in the academy, initial commercial work, not necessarily successful, but then eventually commercial success. And this pattern has continued over and over again throughout all of the technologies that I've described for you today. So now with my remaining time, I want to briefly take you back to 1945 just to remind you that we're not there yet. If my daughter was in the back of the seat, Mom, are we there yet? No, we're just started. Go back to programming Scratch on your computer. So Bush didn't just talk about having the information available to us. He didn't just talk about being able to interact with that information, the kind of things that we do with Google and the kinds of things that we do with Wikipedia and so on today. He talked about how that would be the foundation for discovery, the foundation for how human beings would come together, scientists and non-scientists alike, to create new discoveries about how we understand our world today. And in this place, we're just at the first 5 minutes of that. So what are some hints that are on the horizon? Hopefully many of you have seen Patients Like Me, or you've heard about it. This is not a Wikipedia of medical science. This is creating a new fabric for medical discovery. It is individuals going together, sharing their medical symptoms, their treatments, their prognosis, and being armed and going back to their physicians and saying, well, other individuals are being more successful under a different treatment. Why am I not under that treatment? They're actually running their own clinical trials within this community. They are shaking the foundations of medical science by creating a new type of knowledge community. Speaking of medical science, also returning to the fabric of how we understand human behavior, call attention to an NSF Expedition Center that is looking at behavior imaging. Are the clues to medical challenges such as autism, PTSD, dementia, Alzheimer's, even the behavioral aspect of chronic disease hidden in an understanding of our everyday behavior? And can we create analysis of video, essentially, that is even more powerful than the X-ray and the MRI, because they hold the secrets to understanding our interactions with our physical world, our manifest indications of disease and wellness within our own bodies. And speaking of the physical world, remember to keep coming back to the question of how do we interact with this space. So whether, if anybody recognizes the screen clip from Terminator, this notion of augmented or mixed reality, that people are pretty powerful staring at these screens, but what will we be able to do when the information is completely mixed and integrated with our own physical world, either through our interactions with the present, our understandings of the past, or our ability to reflect and think about the future. Again, augmenting people's capabilities within these systems. And then finally, and I appreciated the question from the last talk, we have an obligation to understand our investment in education and the trajectory of these technologies. These technologies will not be near their potential unless people are educated in new ways of thinking, in new methods of discovery, and that becomes the foundation of our educational system as well. So these are just some snapshots of a program called Directed Discovery at Georgia Tech, where we're connecting using broadband communications and interactive technology classrooms into major laboratories across the world. This is, again, just the very beginning, that we're not teaching, the facts that are now immediately available to us in Wikipedia, but we're teaching the tools for discovery. So in closing, I think we actually have a long list of new challenges ahead of us that still harken back to that 1945 vision. We need new technologies for data acquisition that come into this fabric they're creating. We need the techniques alongside that for data analytics. We need to continuously look for new interaction and visualization paradigms that mirror and complement natural human cognitive capabilities. We're going to create new methods for collaboration and knowledge creation communities akin to what we're seeing the hint of in Patients Like Me. And then we need new strategies for education that bring the rest of human society along with the innovation of these tools so that they can reach their full potential. So thank you very much for your time today.
So I'd like to ask a question about what a person does when they either see or hear something. I mean, one of the things you can say is that if you just presented the information, the job is done. But if they don't understand it, you haven't really done a complete job. You might say, well, the person should get smarter. If this were a medical presentation from a doctor, it may be perfectly lucid to another doctor, but you may not understand the terms. You'd like to turn it into something that's more accessible. If you asked somebody to explain quantum mechanics and came back, quantum mechanics concerns itself with the diagonalization of Hermitian matrices, it might not do the job either. What do you think the prognosis is for the future of actually having information that maybe you can get the source of it, but you can also get the understanding of it better conveyed?
So one of the terms that I overuse in my work, but I just love its evocative quality, is this notion of boundary objects. And what does it mean when we create objects and presentation of information that exist at those seams, that exist at those interfaces? Patient-doctor communication is a classic example of this. And even though we know from every single study with respect to adherence and with respect to health quality outcomes that communication is so critical, but we have underinvested in the technologies that would be able to support that. So we're looking at the design of tools that allow a patient's perspective on their medical challenges and their health and their wellness and their priorities to be reflected alongside the physician's understanding and their priorities. And it takes a long time. Behavior change in physicians is actually harder than behavior change in patients. But the ability to create that common ground, to use tools to create a common understanding, a shared understanding, and then a plan forward. So just a simple example, if a kid is asthmatic, their priorities may be about their throat being itchy because of the inhaler. The physician's priority is actually this kid's not sleeping well. But if you can put those priorities up next to each other, you're more likely to get the kid and the parents to pay attention to what the physician cares about if that dialogue is happening. But those tools, we can now create the basis from that dialogue by mobile tools and how we interact with the kid on a daily basis, and we can bring those together. So that's about creating a shared understanding where the information technology acts as a meeting place. The other thing that I think you're referring to as well is just different layers of common sense or different even cultural perspectives on information. And I'm very interested. One of the beautiful things about Wikipedia is all the actions, behind the scenes, and that's where you see those dialogues and those debates occurring. I would love to see the interfaces that allow us to see those cultural understandings or the cultural perspectives associated with the information there, and allow communities to come together around those shared perspectives. We're a long time in coming in terms of creating those systems, but that's where we'll also be able to meet some of the challenges that you described.
Could you just amplify a little bit on the crowdsourcing? A patient like me is a great example of people taking ownership and going back to their physician, or in the educational, creating communities where people essentially learn. But what are our opportunities for closing that loop? How do we actually gather things from that crowdsourcing and feed it back into generating the next generation of medical advances or educational advances? How do we keep the loop going?
So there's at least two critical things that we must do. And the question is about how do we tap into the power of crowdsourcing, whether it's through medical advances or just across the internet as a whole. Particularly within the medical side, and again, Vannevar Bush describes this for us, is that science must change. The methods and structures of science must change. These individuals are running clinical trials within patients like me. This is not anything that NIH, I think, would ever recognize nor fund at this point in time. We have to be able to create new models and structures for how we understand health and wellness, which is above and beyond medicine and disease, and how we tap into these knowledge communities to do good science. All right? It's a little noisy what's going on in patients like me, but it shows the potential and it shows the promise. That is going to require some very difficult conversations within our community about how to fund some of those initial explorations. But Bush had it back in 1945. Science will change when you're able to bring this information together. The other thing that will have to happen, and this is, we know it will happen, but it'll still be a surprise when it manifests itself, is that we're within the first 5 minutes of what crowdsourcing will look like. Most of crowdsourcing is the equivalent to piecework in the old, fashion mills, right? And how we create economic structures that allow for higher level forms of crowdsourcing and build essentially new models of collaboration and new methods of how we do work and how we do business will allow us to create higher level and higher quality and more exciting crowdsourcing applications. I was at the World Economic Forum meeting, and they referred to a new form of economics called gig economics, which is that people don't have careers per se in the old-fashioned way, but they move from gig to gig. And this is actually a feature of our economy, but it's also looking at new structures of how work goes together. And if you're going to have a gig economics, you need sophisticated crowdsourcing mechanisms that essentially allow people to tap into those gigs and have very productive and informative careers, but nothing like the career that I thought I was going to consider when I graduated from college.